So we've looked at the name of this deity, Yud He Vav He, how it's pronounced, its meaning. Then we're going to look at whether this deity is masculine or feminine. Is this deity a male or female? Does this deity have female characteristics, etc.? Let's begin. So, some theologians and philosophers have declared themselves to be in favor of a theology of silence and to refrain from speculation on the being and attribute of God. They want to be neutral. Why is this? How can human beings speak about a God who transcends them, a God who remains elusive? How can human beings speak about such a being? If God is God, there is no human category that we can use to talk about him adequately. This is why these theologians and philosophers take the stance that they take, some of them take, a theology of silence. However, Judaism and Christianity both have their respective foundations in the belief that God intervenes in human affairs and communicates with them. Their belief is that God cares about humankind and the world. For this reason, the authors of the Old Testament, just like those of the New Testament, have written down the traditions concerning this God in order to pass them on to future generations. In doing so, they felt compelled to use human concepts when speaking about God. Okay. Yud He Vav He is described as if he were masculine in the biblical text. I mean, all the the verbal forms that the Old Testament uses to describe the actions of this deity are masculine. When you look at a history of religion, it would explain the logic of this naming convention by pointing out that Yud He Vav He was originally revered as a Baal. I would explain that word in our series. So Yud He Vav He was originally revered as a Baal, which is a husband, a storm god with necessarily masculine characteristics. It is obvious that most of the Old Testament texts that speak of God present him, whether consciously or not, as a man. Moshe speaks to God face to face, as one will speak man to man, we are told. More than 50 texts in the Old Testament also present Yud He Vav He as a king. Psalms 93 tells us, Yud He Vav He is king. He has attired himself with majesty. Yeah, Yud He Vav He has attired himself. He has girded himself with might. The world also is established that it cannot be moved. Your throne is established of old. You are from everlasting. Now, let's focus on this kingship. As king, God must above all guarantee order and peace for his realm. His realm is creation. That is why the royal psalms often describe Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh as fighting against aquatic monsters, sea monsters, that represent the forces of chaos. Psalm 74, this psalm, which is based on a Ugaritic myth, tells us, but God is king from time immemorial, who works salvation in the midst of the earth. You crumbled the sea with your might. You shattered the heads of the sea monsters on the water. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You give it as food to the people in companies. What the psalmist does here, the psalmist is using here a traditional concept in the ancient Near East, according to which the principal deity is proclaimed king after having vanquished the primordial monsters like Baal in Ugarit and then Marduk in Babylon. This fight is part of both the creation of the world and its maintenance. As I mentioned earlier, this psalm is based on a Ugaritic myth of the victory of Baal over the god of the sea and his assistant. This is the same concept that is borrowed by the New Testament writers. The idea of the God King combating chaos can also be found in the New Testament in the passage of the calming of the storm, Mark chapters 4. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" What is demonstrated here by the author? The lordship of Yeshua, Jesus, is demonstrated by the fact that he threatens the wind and the sea, as Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh does in the Psalms, which is based on the Ugaritic text. So the royal image of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh certainly presupposes the image of a male god. In several of the prophetic books, notably in the books of Hosea, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh is defined as the husband, the Baal, or lover of his people. In the oracles of judgment, Israel appears then as an unfaithful woman who deceives her husband, who is Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, by prostituting herself with other gods. We are told in Hosea, "She went after her lovers and forgot me," says Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. Other texts compare Israel and Judah to sisters who are unfaithful and deceive Yahweh, or Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, their legitimate spouse. So, in the prophetic oracles, the roles are clearly distributed. Yud He Vav He is husband and master, and proprietor, that is the owner of this wife, who thinks of only of deceiving him. That's how it's portrayed. Also, Israel's time in the desert is described as being a honeymoon between Yud He Vav He and his fiancée. Jeremiah 2 tells us, the word of Yud He Vav He came to me saying, go proclaim to Jerusalem. That says Yud He Vav He, I accounted to your favor the devotion of your youth, your love as a bride, how you followed me in the wilderness, in a land not sown. So what we have here is a picture of an erotic marriage, a lustful, a sexual human passion is used here to reveal the passion that Yud He Vav He has for the people of Israel. So in the context of the ancient Near East, there was no alternative but to give Yud He Vav He the role of a man and Israel that of the woman. In these passages, the masculine quality of Yud He Vav He is built into the relational context. Let's carry on. The cult of Yud He Vav He was celebrated in the royal temples in Jerusalem, which is in the south, in Bethel and Dan, which is in the north, and in various other sanctuaries. But we must make a distinction between official religion and popular religion, and then raise the question of the worship of Yud He Vav He in the provinces. Now, the Old Testament itself attests to the existence of what we call Bamot, sanctuaries located on hills, and in most cases in the open air. Even Solomon, we are told, visited one of these sanctuaries that was at Gibeon, where he received a divine message in a dream. We read that in 1 Kings 3. And Solomon loved Yud He Vav He, walking in the statutes of David his father. Only he sacrificed and burnt incense in the high places. And the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. 1,000 burnt offering did Solomon offer upon the altar. In Gibeon, Yud He Vav He appeared to Solomon in a dream by night and said, ask what I shall give you. So, if these high places were so abominable, why does Yud He Vav He come to Shlomo in a dream to dialogue with him? So, we have evidence of these high places, these bemots. Okay, what do we know here? This is very important. So, clean the wax out of your ears and listen carefully. Both archaeology and biblical texts indicate that on these high places, cut stones were placed in a height of 3 meters or more. These stones, called mizbot, were apparently in phallic form and symbolized one of the male deities. So it symbolized an erected penis. Put that in your spirit. These were accompanied by wooden posts called asherot, which represented female deities. Asheroth, Asherah. The name Asherah is the Hebrew form Atharat, which is a goddess with a strong presence in the Canaanite pantheon, above all at Ugarit. It is this worship of Asherah in the form of a sacred post, which is strongly opposed in the biblical text, notably in the book of Deuteronomy. But archaeological finds confirm the association of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh with a goddess, with a wife. They were a couple. From the biblical text, we know that during the time of the monarchy, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh was sometimes worshipped in association with Asherah. The cult of this couple, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh and Asherah, was also part of the theology of the official sanctuaries during the period of the monarchy. So not only is Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh identified as a man, a male, a king, he is a king or a god who has a wife. They are a pair. 2 Kings 18 tells us he abolished the high places and smashed the monuments and cut down the Asherah. This is Hezekiah. But Manasseh restored to the temple an Asherah that had been rejected through the reforms of Hezekiah, we are told in 2 Kings 21. And he built the high places that Hezekiah, his father, had destroyed, and he erected altars to Baal, and he made an Asherah. So Asherah is attested. The wife of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, like I said, they are couples. So it is evident, therefore, that during the time of the monarchy, there had been symbols linked to the worship of a female partner of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, his consort in the great national sanctuaries. When I say a consort is a divine female figure of lower rank seated beside a more influential deity. It is only at the point at which the sanctuaries are destroyed and questioned that the concept of a male Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh accompanied by a goddess becomes unacceptable. It is at the point at which the sanctuaries are destroyed. Before that, the people were very much involved with these couples. Also, we should note that the worship of a goddess called the Queen of Heaven was still very widespread at the time of the Babylonian exile. I repeat that. The worship of a goddess called the Queen of Heaven was still very widespread at the time of the Babylonian exile. It was a cult in which women apparently played a central ritual role in making cakes for the goddess. Two passages from the book of Jeremiah passed down to us by the Deuteronomistic editors severely criticize this cult. We read in Jeremiah 44. Let me give a context. This chapter is put forward as a discourse by Jeremiah to those who fled to escape the Babylonians. The prophet explains to these refugee Judeans that the disaster overcame them because they were constantly worshiping other gods. The recipients, notice, of this criticism strongly contest this interpretation of the fall of Jerusalem and emphasize that by worshiping the Queen of Heaven, they were just doing what they had always done. And that disaster befell them when they had stopped making offerings to her. They argued, no, your interpretation of what happened is not so. It's not because we were worshiping the Queen of Heaven, etc. It was because we stopped. That's what Jeremiah 44 tells us. But we will do everything that has emanated from our mouth to burn incense to the Queen of Heaven and to pour libations to her. As we did, we, our forefathers, our kings, and our princes in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. And we were sated with bread, and we were well, and we saw no evil. But since we stopped burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring libation to her, we lack everything, and we have been consumed by the sword and by famine. So the recipients of this criticism strongly contest the interpretation of the fall of Jerusalem by Jeremiah. And they emphasize that by worshiping the Queen of Heaven, they were just doing what they had always done. So the recipients of this criticism strongly contest this interpretation of the fall of Jerusalem. According to this argument, it is the prohibition of the cult of the goddess through maybe the reforms of Josiah that has rightly provoked all these catastrophes. The implication is that the abolition of the cult of the Queen of Heaven, who is probably Asherah, was still being hotly debated within Judaism in the 6th to the 5th century BCE. We should also note that this cult itself survived in several Christian denominations, since it is Mary who is called Queen of Heaven. We have seen Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh depicted as a male, as a king, as having a wife. Now, we'll go on and find out, why is he called father? And does he have feminine characteristics? We will address this before we move on to find the origins of this deity.